So in this episode we're going to be covering a little bit more wiring, simplifying a lot of the wiring that's on the Micra side. Last time we did a little bit on the VAG side, but this time it's mostly focused on the Micra stuff. Still tidying up a little bit of the VAG wiring, moving it into the cabin and things like that. And we're also going to take a look at the oil filter relocation kit that I sort of touched on in the last video. So the goals for the wiring pretty much boil down to simplifying as much as we can, getting the two systems to talk to each other but still remain independent from each other. We want to safely provide power to the Audi ECU and all of the sensors connected to that ECU, and remove all of the vestigial componentry that's still in the Micra's engine bay from the 1 litre and bring it into the cabin where it's out of the way and nice and safe. Welcome back to the 1.8 20 valve turbo Micra project. This is the first video from the new workshop. Last video I put up was me moving into this workshop, getting everything all up to a certain point where we could actually start working out of it. We've actually moved a lot of the stuff in now and we're pretty much ready to go. But I'm really keen to get cracking with the Micra again because it's been a bit of time since we've actually done any work on it. It's been a little bit of time since I put a video out, so thank you to everyone who's been patient whilst we've been sort of getting on with this whole move. So kicking off then, we'll start off with getting the fuse panel working. So in the last video, you saw the engine crank up for the first time. Big exciting moment, very happy with that. But we were using just a temporary fuse panel or sort of strewn across the top of a temporary workbench. So we want to completely undo all of that and put it into a more permanent position. So we've got Ryan over, who's pretty good with the VAG side of stuff. And we spent a day rerouting all of the wiring so that it was a bit more tidy and a bit more easy to manage. It just means that there's less stuff in the engine bay, and the position of it just means that there's less heat getting to it, less chances of moisture getting to things. I think the ECU is hopefully going to be a lot happier inside of the cabin than it is inside the engine bay. Since I've already removed a few circuits from the harness and cut their wires, it made sense to properly remove them from the main connector in order to keep things tidy.
Oh yeah, that's supposed to happen.
One of the first things I wanted to fix was the problem that you probably saw in the last part, which was where when I turned the engine on, I wasn't able to turn it off again on the key, which is obviously not ideal. I don't want to have to get out of my car and disconnect the battery every time I want to turn the engine off. So the actual problem there is that the ECU is always getting 12 volts from the battery because that's just how I wired it up. That was actually just an error on my side. It was just an oversight, didn't actually mean to do it that way. So the obvious fix here is to make sure that that fuse panel, which powers all of the VAG stuff, only comes on when the key is in the ignition position. So I thought the quickest and easiest way to just sort of see if this works was to try and plug the supply to that fuse panel into something which only gets ignition power. And I thought the best place for that was going to be the cigarette lighter. Now the reason why I wanted to use a cigarette lighter was because it meant that I didn't have to search around for wires and trace back wires to fuses that I knew were on the ignition circuit. I thought that because it was already an easily accessible part of the circuit, that I'd be able to just tap into that and it would be nice and easy. And sure enough, when I put the key on, it actually turned the relays on and the fuse panel provided power to the ECU. We could connect to it through VAGCOM and everything was all working fine until we went to crank it, and we were just getting no signal from the crank position sensor, which was a bit weird. Now basically the engine wasn't firing up. It was cranking fine, but it wasn't firing. And I kind of thought that maybe the reason for that was because the crank position sensor wasn't sending a signal to the ECU, and the ECU needs to use that as a reference so that it knows when to fire the injectors and when to fire the ignition coils. If it doesn't have that signal, it doesn't know what to do, so it just does nothing. So I thought, let's just see if the crank position sensor was working. Now originally I was actually just going to replace that sensor because I genuinely thought I broke it. So the crank position sensor basically reads the teeth on the crank, and it sends like a high-low signal to the ECU, and the ECU works out how fast the crank is spinning depending on how many of those high-low signals it gets per second. The easiest way to test it was to try and get it to read a pulse. Now whenever we tried to crank the engine, the crank position was 0 RPM, it just wasn't reading it. So there had to be a way of getting that sensor to read something even without the engine cranking. So what I did, big brain moment, is I got myself a bolt, a hex head bolt just like this one, stuck it in my drill, and then span the drill next to the sensor. Obviously I've removed it from the engine block. Span this, and the points on here actually register as pulses. So as I was spinning that, it was actually reading an RPM signal through VAGCOM. So we knew that sensor was working. Don't do what I did and do that when you still have pressure in the fuel rail. Now if you're pretty good with vehicle electrics, you probably already know what the problem was here, and that is that the cigarette lighter on most cars doesn't run on the ignition circuit. And when you put a key in your car, you normally have 3 positions. So the way it works is it's off, accessory, ignition and accessory, and then crank. When you crank the engine, the accessory circuit gets 0 volts. Now you probably already know this because when you have your radio on, when you're on the accessory, when you go to crank the engine, the radio turns off and then comes back on again. That's basically what was happening with the ECU. The ECU wasn't getting a constant 12 volts source from the ignition circuit, it was getting it from the accessory circuit. If I'd read the fuse panel, it would have told me that because it tells you that it's on the accessory circuit. I'm an idiot. Naoki came over, looked at it, laughed at me, we fixed it, and it's all running fine now. So with the Audi wiring kind of tidied up, we now need to kind of work on the Micra side of things. Now the Micra's wiring is pretty straightforward. You've actually got 2 main harnesses that go into the engine bay. Now on the driver's side, you have a big chunk of harness that goes to the front of the car, powers the driver's side headlight, it powers the washer bottle, the fog lights, the horns, and that's pretty much it. The passenger side is a little bit more complicated. There's a lot more things in there, including the engine bay fuse panel, the relay panel. You've also got the lighting for that side as well. So each of the lights actually has its own harness that goes down its own respective side of the car, and they're actually connected together with a harness that goes inside the car behind the dashboard. Now a lot of that wiring that's in the passenger side is actually redundant. Now some of that powers the lights, which we're still going to need. There's also the wiper relay is also in there. We need to keep that as well if we want our wipers to work. We definitely do. But there's also a lot of wiring in there that's for the ECU, big power wire because the battery used to be in the engine bay, but the battery is now in the back of the car, so a lot of that wiring can come out. By stripping out all the wiring we don't need, we basically take that wiring harness and basically reduce it down to just a lighting harness. Now because a lot of the fuses that would normally supply power to the lights were in that fuse panel, what we actually do is instead of removing those wires, we strip them back so that they actually branch off before they leave the internal cabin and they go towards that fuse panel that is also powering the Audi stuff. So what we're basically doing is we're taking that engine bay fuse panel and relay panel and bringing it inside the cabin. Functionally, that's all we're doing. If you were kind of doing this yourself, you could actually just drag that fuse panel in. You don't have to do what I've done and make your own panel and make it all fancy and neat. You could just drag that into the cabin or leave it in the engine bay if you want to and just power the Audi fuse box off of that. This is just the way I've decided to do it. What I've actually done is I've taken a load of this stuff out, and where it used to follow along here, I've actually stripped it back so it actually now emerges here. So this is where the exit of the car is. It stays inside the cabin. These cables are to be completely removed, so they just need depinning from the connector, and then all of this is everything that was inside of here but has now been pulled out. So it's power stuff, a few relay holders, those are no longer needed. So these were in the factory fuse panel, so we just need to wire those into the new panel inside the car, give them the power they need with the correct fuse, and then this will just need to be reloomed and then put back on the car again in the same place it was before.
Ah, the classic. Yep. Is it? That's high. Yeah. Bastard.
Now the fuse panel itself is actually powered by a relay that is triggered by the Micra's fuse panel inside of the car. There's actually another fuse panel underneath the steering wheel. That supplies power to a lot of things like the brake lights, provides permanent power to like the interior cabin light, the blower motor for like the heating and the cooling, the radio. Also the ECU relays are powered by that fuse panel as well. So what we've actually done is we've taken the wire that would normally trigger the relay for the Micra's ECU, and it's now powering another relay which is powering that fuse box. So when you put the key in the ignition position, the Micra thinks that it's powering its own ECU, but what it's actually doing is it's powering a secondary fuse box, which is powering all of the Volkswagen stuff. Now the panel that we were using for testing is just a temporary fuse panel. Those panels are pretty good because you've got access to all of the terminals, you can quickly add and remove things. It's quite a good solution, but I just don't like the way that the wires come out the side. It just looks a bit messy, it just looks like spaghetti, and I wanted something that was a little bit more OEM. So what I did was I picked up these modular fuse panels from MTA, and you can get these on eBay and loads of other places, but the thing I like about these is that you can basically build your own panel by clicking the modules together. So in this case, I've got a 16 fuse holder and a 4 relay holder clicked together, and it just looks like one unit. Very neat, very elegant, and it doesn't look too DIY. And because you can just click those units together, they're pretty handy because say you wanted 32 fuses, not 16 fuses, you could just click another one on the bottom of there or on the top. You could have any combination of different types of panel. So that leaves us with quite a neat, elegant solution for the secondary fuse panel. Now the location of that fuse box is going to be behind the glove box, except it's not going to be a glove box anymore. It's just going to be a hatch that covers the fuse panel. So it's going to be an access hatch. There will be like an inner part that will allow me to hold things like the manual, documents, things like that. But for the most part, it's just going to be an access hatch because I don't really keep anything inside my glove box aside from like crap that I accumulate that probably shouldn't be in there in the first place. Right, so next up is the oil filter relocation. So again, going back to the previous episode, I was playing around with radiator fitment and I came up with a little temporary test bracket for fitting the radiator. Now, since I got the engine running, I now have an oil filter hanging out of the front of the engine, and now that means that I can no longer fit a radiator. On the 1.8 turbo, the oil filter kind of sticks out at a funny angle. Now with the oil filter in place, I can't actually progress with the radiator fitment anymore. That is unless I relocate it to another part of the engine bay. Now I think that that's actually probably a good idea anyway, because the amount of space that I have in front of the engine in this car is so minimal that even if I was able to squeeze the oil filter and the radiator in that place, trying to do like an oil change or a service would just be an absolute pain. I don't think I'd be able to remove that filter without potentially damaging the radiator as well. So what I've bought is this oil filter relocation kit from Mocal. I did touch on this on a previous video, but I'll just go into a little bit more detail on it now. So it basically comprises of two parts. You basically have the takeoff plate, which is comprised of a sandwich plate and a mushroom cap that screws on in place of the oil filter. And then it comes out with two -10 AN lines that would then go off to the remote filter head. Now the filter head can actually go anywhere within reason. Now I'm going to attach it to the chassis rail near the gearbox where it's a lot easier to access. As with a lot of these oil filter type things, you've got to make sure that you consider the oil flow. Now assuming it's a spin-on oil filter, which this one is, you basically have the oil that comes into the filter through the holes that go around the edge of that filter. And on most oil filters, not all, but on most, you will have a non-return valve. And it's basically like a rubber diaphragm that sits behind those holes. It allows oil to flow through them into the filter, but not return back up. The oil exits the filter through the middle. So the bit that you screw on, that threaded part, is hollow. And the oil comes back out through the filter, back into the engine or wherever it's going past that point. You need to make sure that when you're plumbing this in, that the oil is able to flow where it needs to go, right? If you don't get this right, what ends up happening is that you end up going through the filter in the wrong direction, and that non-return valve will starve the engine of oil, and you'll very quickly break your engine doing that. I've known of situations where people have plumbed these things in wrong, whether it's like a filter relocation or like an external oil cooler. They've gotten it wrong, and then they've blown their engine up because they've starved it of oil, and it only takes a few seconds to damage it. Maybe not blow it up, but you know, you'll damage some moving stuff, like you'll break bearings and things quite quickly. So just something to consider, something I'm definitely going to be not monkeying around with when I fit this myself. Now you might notice that this kit doesn't include a cooler. I can actually get a cooler for this, but funds were a little bit tight at the time that I bought it. So I've decided to just defer the cooler just for a little bit, because I just need to get the filter relocated first. But plumbing one in is basically just a simple case of adding a thermostatic valve and then also the cooler itself. It's just going to be an air cooler. Now the system actually has a cooler built in. Well, I wouldn't really call it a cooler, it's more like a heat exchanger. And the reason why there's a distinction there is because heat exchangers allow things to cool or heat depending on what you want, right? So for example, if you live in a cold climate and you need your oil to get up to temperature quicker, if the coolant is warmer than the oil is, then the coolant is actually going to heat your oil up, which is good because it needs to be at the right temperature in order to work at its best. If you're in a hot country and your oil is potentially warmer than your coolant is, then that heat exchanger is going to cool the oil with the coolant. But I'm going to be removing the factory system entirely because I don't have the room for it. Having the oil filter housing removed from the block made it much easier to remove what's left of the PCV pipe, so I can fit the other half of my Forge AN adapter kit. Doing this on the engine is possible, but the pipe was so horribly disintegrated that I was worried about debris falling back into the block. Plus, it's easier to get the purchase needed to press the adapter on.
See if you can get 2 fingers in.
How about 4?
Ooh, just about.
Get your old fist in there!
Make sure you lubricate your hole. There we go. Can he do it with one hand?
Without the heat exchanger installed, this pipe is now too long. I replaced it with a shorter version that the takeoff plate can screw directly onto. At this point I wanted to finish installing the kit, but first I had to take care of something else.